Most people don't realize they're overpaying for electricity, and the reason is simple. It never feels obvious enough to question. You open your bill, you see the total, and you assume it reflects exactly what you used. It feels normal, predictable, almost automatic. But over time, small things start to feel off. A slightly higher number one month, another increase the next, even when your routine hasn't really changed. At first, it's easy to ignore because nothing seems dramatic enough to worry about. Then it keeps happening, not in a way that shocks you all at once, but in a way that slowly builds up. And without realizing it, you begin to feel like something doesn't quite match your effort to use less. That's when a different thought starts to appear. What if the amount you're paying isn't just about what you use? What if there are parts of the system that influence your bill in ways you've never really considered? Because once that idea crosses your mind, everything changes. You stop looking at your bill as just a number and start wondering how that number is actually created. Before we go deeper into this, make sure you subscribe and leave a like, because most people never hear this explained in a way that actually makes sense. And once you start noticing these patterns, you won't be able to unsee them. Also, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments, because this is something people are experiencing everywhere, not just in one place. Now here's what most people don't realize. Overpaying doesn't always feel like a big mistake. It doesn't show up as something obvious or alarming. Instead, it happens gradually in small differences that seem easy to dismiss. And because those differences are small, they don't trigger any immediate reaction. You don't question them deeply. You just accept them as part of how things work, even if they don't fully make sense. But once you start paying closer attention, those small differences begin to form a pattern. And that's when you realize there might be more behind your electricity bill than you've ever been told. At some point, almost everyone has that moment where they look at their electricity bill and feel like something doesn't quite match their reality. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in a subtle, almost quiet way that sits in the back of your mind. Because when you think about your routine, nothing really changed that much. You wake up at the same time, you use the same appliances, you go through the same daily habits, and yet somehow the number at the end of the month doesn't seem to reflect that consistency. At first, it's easy to explain it away. You tell yourself it's probably the weather. Maybe you use the air conditioning a little more. Maybe something stayed plugged in longer than usual. And those explanations feel good enough in the moment because they help you move on without thinking too much about it. But the problem is that over time, those small differences keep showing up, and eventually those explanations don't feel as convincing as they used to. What makes this even more interesting is how normal this has become. Almost everyone has experienced this at some point, but very few people actually stop to question it deeply. It becomes one of those things that you just accept as part of life, like it's something outside of your control, something that just happens, and that belief alone is enough to keep most people from ever looking closer. Because the moment you assume something is out of your control, you stop trying to understand it, you stop analyzing it, you stop paying attention to the details. And when that happens, you remain disconnected from how it actually works, not because it's impossible to understand, but because no one really takes the time to observe it closely. The reality is that your electricity bill isn't just a simple reflection of how much energy you used. It's the result of a system, and that system takes into account more than most people realize. It considers timing, demand, distribution, and a series of variables that are constantly changing in the background, even if your personal habits stay exactly the same. Imagine 2 days that feel identical to you. You wake up, you go through your routine, you use your devices in the same way. Everything feels consistent from your perspective, but behind the scenes, the system might be operating under completely different conditions. Demand in your area might be higher. The cost of supplying energy at that moment might be different. And the way that energy is distributed across the grid might have shifted without you even noticing. And that's where the disconnect begins. Because from your point of view, nothing changed. But from the system's point of view, everything did. And that difference is what creates the feeling that something isn't adding up because the result doesn't match the effort you feel like you're making. Most people believe there's a direct relationship between usage and cost. They think if they use less, they automatically pay less. And while that can be true in some cases, it's not the full picture, because the system that calculates your bill is influenced by multiple factors, not just one simple measurement. Once you start to think about it this way, something shifts in your perspective. You begin to realize that what you've been treating as a fixed and predictable expense is actually something more dynamic, something that reacts to a combination of elements rather than a single action, and that realization alone changes how you see your electricity bill. Instead of just reacting to the number, you begin to observe it. You start paying attention to when it goes up, when it stays stable, when it behaves differently than you expected, and even if you don't fully understand every detail, you begin to notice that there is a pattern behind what once felt random. And that's where awareness begins, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual shift in how you think about something you've seen your entire life. Because now you're no longer just accepting it, you're questioning it, you're observing it, and you're starting to understand that there might be more to it than what appears on the surface. That small shift might not seem like much at first, but over time it changes everything. Because once you start paying attention, you can't go back to not seeing it. You begin to notice details that were always there, but that you never really considered before. And that awareness is what sets the foundation for everything that comes next. Before we go any further, there's something worth mentioning. Because once people start noticing these patterns and questioning their electricity bill, many of them begin looking into different ways to better understand what's actually happening behind the scenes, not in a complicated or overly technical way, but through simple ideas and approaches that help them see things from a different perspective. And if you're curious to explore what some of those people are discovering and how they're thinking about energy differently, there's a link in the description where you can take a closer look and decide for yourself. Now, once you start paying attention to your electricity bill over a longer period of time, something interesting begins to happen. It stops feeling random. Those small variations that once seemed disconnected begin to form subtle patterns. And even if those patterns aren't immediately obvious, you start to notice that certain moments, certain habits, and certain conditions seem to influence the final number more than you originally thought. This is where most people begin to realize that their bill isn't just reacting to their personal usage. It's reacting to a much larger system that operates continuously in the background, a system that adjusts in real time based on demand, supply, and distribution, all of which are constantly shifting throughout the day without you ever seeing it directly. For example, think about how energy demand changes over the course of a single day. In the morning, when people are waking up, using appliances, turning on lights, and starting their routines, demand begins to rise. Later in the afternoon, it might stabilize. And then in the evening, when everyone is home again, cooking, using electronics, and running multiple devices at once, demand can spike significantly, and all of this affects how the system behaves at that moment. Even though you're not consciously thinking about these shifts, they are happening around you all the time, and they can influence how energy is delivered and how costs are structured, which means that two identical actions performed at different times might not have the same impact in the final calculation of your bill. That's where the idea of timing becomes more important than most people realize, because it's not just about how much energy you use, but when you use it. And once that idea starts to settle in, it changes the way you think about your daily habits, even if you don't immediately act on it. Some people begin experimenting in small ways, not because they fully understand everything, but because they're curious to see if changing certain habits might lead to different results. They might shift when they use certain appliances, or simply pay more attention to how their routine aligns with different times of the day. And even those small observations can reveal interesting patterns over time. What's important here isn't the specific change itself, but the shift in mindset, because instead of just consuming energy without thinking about it, they begin interacting with it, observing it, try and understand how their behavior connects with the system around them, and that awareness alone creates a completely different experience. Now, this doesn't mean that everything suddenly becomes clear or predictable. The system is still complex, and there are still variables that most people won't fully see. But the difference is that you're no longer completely disconnected from it. You start to notice relationships between actions and outcomes, even if those relationships aren't perfectly linear. And that's where curiosity grows even more, because once you realize there are patterns, you naturally want to understand them better. You start asking questions you never asked before, not just about how much you're using, but about how energy behaves as a whole, how it flows, how it's influenced by different conditions, and what that might mean for you. Some people take this curiosity a step further and begin exploring simple concepts or setups they come across, not because they expect instant results, but because they want to see how those ideas work in practice. And sometimes just seeing those concepts in action is enough to completely change the way they think about energy. Because now, Instead of seeing electricity as something distant and abstract, it starts to feel more tangible, something you can observe, something you can think about, something that isn't entirely out of reach in terms of understanding. And that shift is powerful, because it moves you from a passive position, where you simply accept whatever number appears on your bill, into a more aware position, where you begin to question, observe, and gradually understand what's happening around you. It doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't require you to become an expert. It simply starts with paying attention, noticing patterns, and being curious enough to explore what those patterns might mean. And once that process begins, it naturally leads you to see things in a completely different way. At a certain point, everything starts to connect in a way that feels almost obvious, but only after you've taken the time to really pay attention, because what once looked like random numbers on a bill now begins to feel like the result of something much bigger, something structured, something that follows patterns even if those patterns aren't immediately visible at first glance. And once you reach that point, it's hard to go back to the way you used to see things, because now you understand that your electricity bill isn't just a simple reflection of your usage. It's the outcome of a system that responds to multiple factors at the same time, some of which you can see and many of which operate quietly in the background without ever being explained clearly. That realization changes your perspective in a subtle but powerful way, because instead of reacting to the number every month, you begin to observe it. You begin to think about what might have influenced it, what might have shifted, what might have been different even if your habits stayed the same. And over time, that awareness starts to replace the frustration you once felt. What's interesting is that this shift doesn't require you to become an expert or completely understand every technical detail. It simply requires you to stay curious, to pay attention, and to accept that there is more happening than what appears on the surface. And that alone already puts you in a very different position compared to most people. Because most people never get to this point. They continue treating their electricity bill the same way they always have. They open it, react to it, maybe complain about it for a moment, and then move on without ever questioning what's behind it. And as a result, nothing really changes for them. But once you start questioning, once you start observing, something shifts internally. Because now you're no longer completely dependent on something you don't understand. You begin to feel like there is at least a possibility of seeing things differently. And that possibility is where everything begins. It's not about finding a perfect solution overnight. And it's not about believing that there's one single answer that fixes everything instantly. It's about recognizing that understanding always comes before change. And the more you understand, even at a basic level, the more aware your decisions become. And awareness has a way of influencing everything else. Because when you're aware, you start noticing inefficiencies, you start questioning habits, you start thinking twice about things that once felt automatic, and over time those small shifts begin to add up in ways that most people underestimate. Some people take that awareness further and begin exploring ideas they come across, not with the expectation that everything will change immediately, but with the intention of understanding what's possible, how different approaches work, and whether any of those ideas make sense for their situation. And sometimes just seeing those ideas, just understanding that there are different ways to think about energy, is enough to completely change the way you approach it. Because it removes that feeling of being stuck, it replaces it with curiosity, and curiosity naturally leads to exploration. That's really the biggest difference between people who stay in the same situation and those who eventually see change. It's not that one group has all the answers and the other doesn't. It's that one group stays curious while the other stops questioning. And once you stop questioning, everything becomes fixed. Everything feels like it has to be the way it is. But the moment you start questioning again, even in a small way, you begin to see possibilities that were always there but never fully considered. So if you've been feeling like your electricity bill doesn't quite make sense, if you've noticed those small inconsistencies that don't fully match your habits, and if you're curious enough to explore what might be behind all of that, then it might be worth taking a closer look at some of the ideas people are already exploring. You can check the link in the description and see for yourself what they're looking into, how they're approaching it, and whether any of it resonates with you. No pressure, no assumptions, just something to observe and decide on your own. Because at the end of the day, the real difference isn't in having all the answers. It's in being willing to look deeper, to stay curious, and to question things just enough to see them in a completely different way. And once you reach that point, you don't really go back to seeing things the way you did before.